a veteran, a U.S. Army veteran and Purple Heart recipient by the name of Joe Biggs, identified in the media as an organizer for the Proud Boys, who was sentenced today to 17 years in prison for the events of January 6th, the second longest such sentence handed out for that date. He's accused of helping to tear a fence down. So the court considers that an act of terrorism. For more on this, I want to turn to a woman who was in the courtroom. Julie Kelly joins us now. Julie, good to have you with us.
Hey, Vince. Thanks for having me on.
And I should point out, as always, she's the author of Declassified by Julie Kelly, the Substack. It's excellent. Julie, tell us what happened here.
I mean, it's like you're living in La La Land. You have Joe Biden's Department of Justice, D.C. U.S. Attorney Matthew Graves, who's handling all these January 6 cases, put forward seditious conspiracy charges against people like Joe Biggs. They're convicted, of course, by a D.C. jury. And then they go to the government, to the courts. And in this case, it's Judge Tim Kelly, an alleged conservative judge appointed by Donald Trump, and asked him for 33 years in prison for Joe Biggs. Now, what did Joe Biggs do? Nothing violent. He didn't bring a weapon. He didn't attack any lawmakers. He didn't assault police officers. The fence shaking incident was really shaking part of a temporary metal fence. That is the incident that Matthew Graves and the Department of Justice claim under the statute in very vague language that he destroyed government property, and therefore that rises to a crime, a federal crime of terrorism. Now, any judge with half a brain or a conscience or anything would say this is so out of bounds. But no, we're talking about Judge Tim Kelly, who did not do that and went along with Joe Biden's Department of Justice, claiming that shaking a temporary metal fence on the outside of the U.S. Capitol is indeed a crime of terrorism, and therefore he considered the sentencing enhancement of up to 10 extra years in prison on top of the other convictions that Joe Biggs has.
I mean, a lot of things jump to mind here. One of them is if shaking a fence is your best example of terrorism, you don't have a terrorism case. I mean, that's the most impressive thing they could bring before the court. Come on, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. The other is, shouldn't this have actually been, just as a basic constitutional principle, isn't this the kind of thing that should be litigated in front of a jury and a judge doesn't just decide, yep, it's an act of terrorism, and then slaps on more time?
Well, you would think so, but this is based on the federal sentencing guidance. There was a commission, and then they came up with sentencing guidance. Now, Judge Kelly doesn't have to go along with it, and he did not give the full amount that DOJ had requested based on those guidance. But the mere fact that you have a conservative Trump-appointed federal judge who has now codified the shaking of a metal fence as a crime of terrorism, think of the long-term consequences of that. And this is now has a judge's federal imprimatur on it. But it's not only that crime, Vince. It's obstruction of an official proceeding that now is a federal crime of terrorism. Conspiracy to obstruct is a federal crime of terrorism. These are the sort of nebulous, vague, weaponized laws that have been exploited by the Department of Justice. But now judges like Tim Kelly and Amit Mehta, an Obama-appointed judge, have now said, yes, these rise to federal crimes of terrorism.
And I can't help but notice, all of the other many events that involved a lot more damage than fence shaking that the left perpetrated on the country with no meaningful consequences like this. When you have a federal courthouse in Portland that was under sustained assault for months, where you had cops routinely attacked and blinded by lasers and Molotov cocktails thrown and all sorts of destruction. The destruction at the White House in 2020. None of this with any meaningful consequence. And now this man, Joseph Biggs, is being given 17 years for shaking a fence.
Vince, aside from that, think of what happened in Washington, D.C. for weeks, just 6 months before January 6th. You had people across the street from the White House trying to tear down barriers and fences to the White House. trying to scale walls to get into the White House, prompting the lockdown of Donald Trump and his family. They were burning things across the street, like the basement of St. John's Church right across the street from the White House. They were tearing down fences that federal police officers had installed in that area on federal property. Not only none of those people even arrested or charged, any charges that were made have been dropped by the same DC U.S. Attorney's Office, now declaring shaking part of a metal fence a crime of terrorism. I mean, this is the sort of double standard hypocrisy that makes Americans, well, at least Americans on our side, infuriated. The events of 2020 that summer have been completely memory holed, completely forgiven and forgotten. But yet, here is Joe Biggs, who, by the way, has already been in prison for 30 months because Judge Kelly denied his release repeatedly, awaiting trial. So and as he explained today, 22 hours, sometimes up to 22 hours a day in solitary confinement.
Oh.
And so now his torment is going to continue. A man who committed no violence aside from shaking a fence and going into the Capitol building, a public building on a Wednesday afternoon, twice that day.
My understanding is that the events inside that courtroom today were rather emotional, Julie Kelly, and that he, of course, appealed and said to the judge that he doesn't think he should serve that time. He would not like to serve that time because he has a young daughter to attend to. Can you give us a sense of what went down as Joseph Biggs made his case?
It was emotional. He broke down at one point, obviously, said all he wants to do is get home to his daughter, to drive her to school and pick her up. He's basically a single father. And, you know, supporters in the courtroom were sobbing along with him and, you know, sobbing as they were anticipating Judge Kelly's verdict, sentencing that was going to come down. So it was emotional. You know, there was another emotional day yesterday, Vince, as Judge Maida sentenced a 61-year-old grandmother from Florida who went inside the Capitol for 18 minutes, sentenced her to 15 months in prison. She's already been on home detention for 2.5 years, wearing an ankle monitor. She has no criminal history either. She did nothing violent on January 6th. This is nothing more than a Marxist-type, banana republic-style judicial and legal system in our own nation's capital. These people are not only completely flouting the Constitution and the rule of law, but they have no humanity. They have no compassion. They are soulless, vindictive, and in some cases sadistic people who enjoy inflicting pain on Americans because they did not support Joe Biden in the last election.
What a bunch of disgraceful people. And what we're looking at is political imprisonment. So now we've got grandmothers. You said 81 years old? That's how old she is?
61.
Oh, excuse me, 61. I misheard.
It's been a long week.
But still, 61 years old, and now going to serve well over a year in prison. And you get an Army veteran whose nation gave him a Purple Heart because of wounds that he sustained on behalf of our country, is now going to be looking at 17 years in jail, in addition to the time that he spent in solitary confinement already.
That's right. Then he'll be unsupervised released. And I mean, look, Joe Biggs' life is destroyed. Everyone who has been ensnared in this, whether it's Joe Biggs convicted of seditious conspiracy or petty offenses like parading in the Capitol, or Connie Meggs, the 61-year-old grandmother who, by the way, her husband Kelly, as a member of the Oath Keepers, Judge Maida sentenced him to 12 years in prison. So you're going to have a family without parents, 2 children, 3 grandchildren without parents, because Judge Maida, an Obama appointee, and Joe Biden's Department of Justice want to make an example of them, not just punish them, but show Americans on the right, if you protest, if you come up against this regime, if you do anything that we don't approve of, not only will you go to prison, your spouse can go to prison if she was there as well, and your whole family will be bankrupted, decimated, and destroyed.
Is it your view, you may have already have said this, but I just want to hear it, is it your view that the United States District Court for the District of Columbia should be defunded and collapsed?
The D.C. District Court should be collapsed. The D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office should be collapsed, and so too should the Washington FBI Field Office. That is the rot of corruption in our country right now. All they do is work collaboratively to investigate, arrest, prosecute, whether it's Donald Trump, down to, a supporter, grandma from Florida or grandma from Indiana. Vince, this week, I think I've seen the most arrests in the January 6th investigation than I've seen in the past few months. I'm getting notifications of a few arrests every day. They're accelerating the pace of this investigation. It's not going away. Matthew Graves, the Biden-appointed D.C. U.S. attorney, has promised to more than double the existing caseload. We could end up with 2,500 or so Americans arrested, charged, destroyed, bankrupted, et cetera, for even the most minor involvement in the events of January 6th. So anyone who's wishing January 6th away, including some Republican candidates for president, I've got news for you. It's not going anywhere. It's actually in some ways getting worse.
How could you let it go away? How could you, meaning how could you let your focus slip away from this? And the reality here is this Matthew Graves character, this disgraceful U.S. attorney for D.C. Last year, I brought it up before and I'll reemphasize it now. He did not prosecute 70% of the street arrests made in Washington, D.C. For the criminals that are actually in D.C. committing acts of violence, he didn't prosecute 70% of those cases. He just dropped them. And here he is trying to destroy the lives of grandmothers in their 60s.
Matthew Graves is also the D.C. U.S. attorney who declined to prosecute Hunter Biden for his tax crimes in 2013 and 2014 in Washington, D.C. So he is one of the two prosecutors who allegedly David Weiss and the IRS people went to, laid out all the tax crimes that Hunter Biden committed those years, and he declined, I believe, not just once, but twice to prosecute Hunter Biden while he continues to round up, memas and people for parading in the Capitol.
Yes.
And I know that Congress has called Matthew Graves in once before. I think they've subpoenaed him again in the Hunter Biden investigation. But look, our side is worn out. We know where this is headed, absolutely nowhere. There will be no consequences. And meanwhile, you've got people like Joe Biggs and Connie Meggs and 1,000+ individuals and counting who are being tormented by this Department of Justice and FBI.
Yeah, and they're all and all of them are sort of test runs and cannon fodder for the big fish, too, because you're watching it play out now with Donald Trump because they're trying to prevent him from even appearing on ballots nationwide at this very moment. Right. And they're using the justice system as their weapon. And they've had a lot of practice on everyday Americans up until this point.
So if you have a federal judge in Washington, D.C. declare that obstruction of an official proceeding and conspiracy to obstruct are crimes of terrorism, those are two of the 4 counts that special counsel Jack Smith has against Donald Trump. So, of course, if they move forward with that indictment, they don't add charges and defendants, which I'm still expecting that they will. You get a quick conviction by D.C. jury. Of course, they hate Donald Trump. And then what? The same Department of Justice, Jack Smith, goes to Judge Chutkan, Judge Tanya Chutkan, who just on Monday, compared January 6th to the Boston Marathon bombing and 9/11. These are the kind of lunatics that populate the D.C. federal courthouse, by the way. So they could very easily go to Judge Chutkan and say, well, of course, he's been convicted of these nonviolent offenses that have nothing to do with a political protest. But, oh, by the way, Judge Amit Mehta has declared that those are crimes of terrorism. So we will seek a similar sentencing enhancement for Donald Trump.
Oh, it makes you so sad for our country, doesn't it? It is just brutal.
It does.
So finally, I mentioned, what should be done here. You obviously recommended a number of, it sounds like great options, getting rid of the U.S. attorney in D.C., getting rid of not the justice system. We'll still have a justice system, but get rid of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. Are there any Republicans that you're detecting who are switched on about this? Is hope in sight, Julie Kelly?
I wish I could say that there was. But, I occasionally will get texts from lawmakers, like, saw your tweet and what can we do? And I'm like, I've told you people already. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm very frustrated. This was a long week and it was a very heartbreaking week to see what these people are going through.
Yes.
But, Vince, these lawmakers have no clue what's going on. Not one of them. Can you imagine if you had had 15 Republican lawmakers, including, say, Kevin McCarthy or Jim Jordan, show up in Judge Tim Kelly's courtroom today? or show up to his courtroom Tuesday when he was regurgitating the government's case and hinting that he was going to add this terror enhancement. Do you think he would have said the same thing had they been sitting there? Do you think he would have said something if there was a camera in his courtroom and we could make clips of his outrageous comments, not just this week, throughout the 2.5-year ordeal of these Proud Boys? There hasn't been not one lawmaker has sat in. You don't have to go even in support. Just pay attention. You do still, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they do still have oversight capability of the judiciary, do they not?
Yes, they do.
I mean, they confirm judges. They pay for the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., but they can't show up there and see what these people are doing to their own supporters.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we got a lot more browbeating and aggression to do with these Republicans.
We do.
In the meantime, Julie Kelly, thank you. God bless you for staying on top of this. And in the end, I hope something very good comes of all of it. If it does, it'll be in no small part because of your work. Thank you, Julie.
Well, that's so kind. And Vince, thank you for covering my work from the very beginning.